Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about terrestrial phytosystems. So these are systems where we use above ground land plants that are going to basically clean up either the soil or the groundwater beneath the soil. So this is land applications for removal of contaminants from soil and groundwater. There's tons of different species that can be utilized, ferns, sunflowers, poplar trees. Here is pictured a willow tree, which are really good. And here, this is a picture, I believe this is, I can't remember which nuclear power plant, it might be Fukushima, but you can see the sunflowers that are being grown right beside it. And we're going to talk more about that application later. So these are just going to be land plants that remove contaminants from the soil and or groundwater. The methods in which they do that is usually some kind of hyperaccumulation within the plant tissues themselves. Plants, of course, draw water from the ground into their roots and stems, and then and on into the leaves and whatnot. That's the way they drink water, right? So as they pull that water, they're going to pull all the contaminants with it, and then in some cases the plants will actually then vent those contaminants into the air, where they get diluted, into the atmosphere. Some plants will actually take these contaminants that are present and transform them and biodegrade them into less toxic or non-toxic compounds. And then sometimes it's not the plants that are doing the job, it's actually the plants are just creating a very nutrient and oxygen-rich environment where microbes can grow, and then they're the ones that do all the biodegradation. So these are the different methods that we're going to discuss. All right, let's first talk about metal phytoremediation. So this is going to be the removal of metals from the soil. Some of the ways in which this is carried out, the three methods we're going to talk about are phytoextraction, rhizofiltration, and phytostabilization. Metals that can be removed include copper, nickel, zinc, lead, chromium, and cadmium, among others, but these are the most common that we have to deal with. So let's first talk about phytoextraction. So this involves the uptake of these metal contaminants from the soil by the roots of the plants, and then translocating those metals into the above ground regions of the plants, so within the roots and the stems and the leaves. The plants that do this, they're typically called hyperaccumulators, and they can absorb really large amounts of these metals. Of course, there's certain plants that are more appropriate than others. They're based on the type of contaminant that's present, the regional climate, and then other relative site conditions. So there has to be some thought into which type of plants you use. Once the plants have taken up the metals, then the plants are harvested. And so now the metals have been removed from the land, so they've been removed from the site permanently, but now they're inside of the plants. And then you can plant more plants and repeat the process over again, and you can keep doing that until the levels of whatever metal it is you're trying to get rid of, like zinc or nickel, for example, once it gets to acceptably low levels, then the site has been considered fully remediated. Now, a big criticism of this is you're just shifting the problem from one place to another, right? Now you had the contaminant in the land, now the contaminant's in the plants. Now you got to figure out, you got to do something with the plants. They still have to be disposed of. They're still carrying these toxic metals. Usually what you can do is either compost them or incineration. You can also possibly maybe dry up the plants and try to recycle the metals if they're valuable. Like, nickel would be a good example for that. If it's a metal that's not very valuable, then it wouldn't be worth the time and effort to do that. But so anyway, that's phytoextraction. So another method is called rhizofiltration. Now this is where the toxins are absorbed into or adsorbed onto the plant roots of the plant, the roots of the plant. And usually this is contaminants that are present in the soil water. So this is typically used for contamination in the groundwater rather than the soil itself. So what we described earlier with phytoextraction, we're really talking about contaminants in the soil. With rhizofiltration, it's the same general process, but it's drawing it up from the groundwater instead of from the soil. So like phytoextraction, the same thing happens. The plants are harvested after a period of time, and they're going to require some form of treatment to completely destroy and dispose of the metal contaminants. One of the examples, and this isn't metal, this is radioactive isotope, but sunflowers were used at Chernobyl in the Ukraine after that tragic nuclear power plant meltdown, and also in Fukushima in Japan as well. So this next method is phytostabilization. Now phytostabilization, like the other methods we have described, also makes use of the uptake and accumulation by adsorption onto or precipitation around the roots of the plants. However, the big difference here with phytostabilization versus the other two previous methods is that the plants are not harvested. So you don't actually remove the contaminants, you just immobilize them so that they can't spread. It reduces their bioavailability and prevents their migration off-site. So it just kind of keeps the contaminants, like in a hot zone or whatever, it keeps them in place so that it doesn't migrate to other areas. All right, so let's talk about, so that's it for the metals. Now let's talk about organic phytoremediation. So when we talk about organic pollutants, like we've talked about in the past, generally we're talking about things like pesticides or solvents, lubricants, and of course gas and diesel oil, crude oil are all good examples. So the mechanisms that we're going to talk about here are phytodegradation, rhizodegradation, and phytovolatization. So let's first talk about phytodegradation. It's also called phytotransformation, and it basically is just like what we've talked about biodegradation by microorganisms in the past, only this time we're talking about in plants. So the plants themselves take up the contaminants, and sometimes they take up the contaminants and then carry out metabolic processes that break the contaminants down. Sometimes, however, the plants, instead of taking them internally, they'll just secrete enzymes externally that carry out the same process. So these complex organic molecules of the pollutants are broken down into simpler substances and generally incorporated into the. So the next method is rhizodegradation. This is also called phytostimulation or rhizospheric biodegradation. Now in this case, it's not the plants that are breaking down the contaminants, it's microorganisms. So this is really plain old biodegradation like we've already discussed previously in this class. But what we're talking about here is specifically these soil-dwelling, also called edaphic microorganisms that like to live near plants because plants, you know, they grow in the ground and they have the roots, right? And what do plants do? Plants take sunlight and carbon dioxide and water and convert it to glucose and then release oxygen as a byproduct. Well, bacteria like to eat glucose for food, and in order to metabolize that glucose, they need oxygen. So, you know, they have this symbiotic relationship because the bacteria also do things for the plant, like fix nitrogen so that it can use nitrogen to, you know, make all of its components like DNA and things like that. So, and proteins, whatever. So, they have this symbiotic relationship. And bacteria like to grow near plants because the plants provide this optimum environment for their growth. So this area around the roots is called the rhizosphere. And by planting plants in the ground, you're activating the microbes to do their thing. And that high level of microbial activity is what breaks down the contaminants. So another method is called phytovolatization. This again involves the uptake of the contaminants by the plants, but in this case the contaminants get released out of the plants via the leaves to the atmosphere. This relies on transpiration, which is that pull of water from the groundwater, up through the roots of the trees or the plants and then out through the leaves. Poplars, which are pictured here, this is a picture of poplar trees. These are really good for this because they have an enormous hydraulic pull. So like if you ever have like a area in your yard that dips down and a lot of water accumulates in that area, poplars are really good to plant there because they'll just suck up that water like crazy. They act like kind of like solar powered water pumps. Now, what's important about this is you have to ensure that there is significant atmospheric dilution effect, meaning that when the contaminant is released, it's quickly and readily diluted into the atmosphere at a level that is non-toxic. Otherwise, we're just moving one problem from one place to another, again, from the soil to the air, which would not be good. So we have to make sure that this, that this process is actually diluting out the toxin to a level where it's non-harmful. All right, so just some other terrestrial phytotechnologies that necessarily don't have to do with remediation. Hydraulic containment is the use of trees to pull out groundwater. And this is kind of like the idea again of stabilization, of immobilization. If there's contaminants in the soil, you're not trying to get rid of them, but you're trying to prevent them from sinking further down into the soil until they get to the groundwater. So it's a manner of preventing them from doing that, where they can't spread. Buffer strips. These are usually found like along rivers, and this picture here is showing this. Like this is a riparian, which usually refers to rivers, buffer, and they're found like along rivers. And so when you have like agriculture, crops, being grown, and you use a lot of fertilizer, so there's going to be a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen that you don't want to then, flow into streams and rivers where they could cause the nitrogen and phosphorus to be too high and kill off fish and stuff like that. So you have these buffer strips that absorb all those nutrients as the runoff, from the fields gets to these buffers, and then the plants soak up all those nutrients and prevent them from being dumped into the rivers. Another example is vegetative caps. This is a means of finishing off landfill sites. So when a landfill is full, you just plant a bunch of grass or plants or trees of some sort on top of the landfill. And so this is going to prevent rainwater from percolating down into the landfill. It minimizes the amount of leachate that's produced and also reduces erosion. So this is like you could use plants instead of using some kind of clay or geopolymer barrier. And then the last one is a biobund, which I've got pictured here, a bunch of trees. You can see behind the trees it's like some kind of industrial something going on. A lot of times you just have these densely planted trees to reduce noise pollution from roads, railways, or industrial sites. So they can actually kind of serve as a barrier. A lot of times you see this like even in neighborhoods and stuff. If you're driving down a busy highway and you're driving by a really nice neighborhood, you'll see a whole bunch of trees lined up that kind of creates a barrier between the road and the neighborhood. Okay, so that's it for the terrestrial phytotechnologies. In the last lecture, we're going to talk about aquatic systems.